Last week of school again in Aquay. Brown doesn't have to wear a tie. It's also very, very hot, so we wouldn't want to wear one anyway. It's also our last chapter of Mice and Men. It's a short chapter, but obviously an important one because it concludes the book. So we'll get right into it. The deep green pool of the Salinas River was still in the late afternoon. Already the sun had left the valley to go climbing up the slopes of the Gabilan Mountains, and the hilltops were rosy in the sun. But by the pool among the mottled sycamores, a pleasant shade had fallen. A water snake glided smoothly up the pool, twisting its periscope head from side to side, and it swam the length of the pool and came to the legs of a motionless heron that stood in the shallows. A silent head and beak lanced down and plucked it out by the head, and the beak swallowed the little snake while its tail waved frantically. A far rush of wind sounded, and a gust drove through the tops of the trees like a wave, and the sycamore leaves turned up their silver sides. The brown, dry leaves in the ground scudded a few feet, and a row upon row of tiny wind waves flowed up the pool's green surface. As quickly as it came, the wind died, and the clearing was quiet again. The heron stood in the shallow, motionless, waiting. Another little water snake came up the pool, turning its periscope head from side to side. And then Lenny appeared out of the bush. He came silently, as a creeping bear moves. The heron pounded its wings and jacked itself clear of the water and flew down the river. The little snake slid among the reeds at the pool's side. Lenny came quietly to the pool's edge. He knelt down and drank, barely touching his lips to the water. When a little bird skittered over behind him, he jerked his head up and strained for the sound with his eyes and ears until he saw the bird, and then he dropped his head and drank again. I had an ant on my leg. When he finished, he sat down at the bank, at the side of the pool so he could watch the trail's entrance. He embraced his knees and laid his chin down on. The light climbed out of the valley, and as it went, the tops of the mountains seemed to blaze with increasing brightness. I think in every chapter, Steinbeck writes about what the lighting is like, right? It seems to have been really important to him. And remember, it was supposed to be a play too. So maybe he was, sort of suggesting how the stage might be lit. Lenny said softly, "I didn't forget, you bet. I didn't forget, hide in the brush and wait for George." He pulled his hat down low over his eyes. "George is gonna give me hell," he said. "George's gonna wish I was alone and not bothering him." He turned his head and looked at the bright mountaintops. "I can go right off in there and find a cave," he said. And he continued sadly, "I'll never have no ketchup, but I won't care. If George don't want me, I'll go away, I'll go away." And then from Lenny's head came a little old fat woman, so he's imagining this. She wore thick bullseye glasses, and she wore a huge gingham apron with pockets in the front. It was starched and clean. She stood in front of Lenny and put her hands disapprovingly on her hips. She frowned. I told you, she said. "I told you. Mind George, 'cause he's such a nice fella, and he's good to you. But you never take no care, do you? You do bad things, Lenny." Lenny answered her. "I tried, Aunt Clara, I tried, ma'am, I tried, but I couldn't help it." "You never give a thought to George," she went on. "He's doing nice things for you all the time. When he got a piece of pie, you always got half, more than half sometimes. And if they had ketchup, why, he'd give it all to you." I know, said Lenny miserably. "I tried, Aunt Clara, ma'am, I tried. She interrupted him. "All the time you could have had such a good time. He could have had such a good time if it wasn't for you. He would have gone and raised hell in a whorehouse. He could have played in a pool room, playing snooker. But instead, he took care of you." Lenny moaned with grief. "I know, Aunt Clara, I know, ma'am. I'll go right off in the hills and I'll find a cave and I'll live there and I won't be no more trouble to George." "You're just saying that," she said sharply. "You're always just saying that. And you just ain't never gonna do it. You're just gonna stick around and stew, by Jesus. Stew with George all the time." Lenny said, "I might just go well away. George ain't gonna let me tend to no rabbits now." Aunt Clara was gone, and from out of Lenny's head there came a gigantic rabbit. Some more imagining. It sat on its haunches in front of him and waggled its ears and crinkled its nose at him, and it spoke to Lenny. "10 rabbits, it said scornfully. "You crazy bastard. You ain't fit to lick the boots of no rabbit. You forget 'em and you let them go hungry. That's what you do. And then what do you think George would think?" "I would not forget," Lenny said loudly. "The hell you wouldn't," said the rabbit. You ain't worth a grease jack pin to ram you into hell. Christ. Christ knows George done everything he can to jack you out of the sewer, but he ain't done you no good. If you think George is gonna let you tend to rabbits, you're even crazier than usual. He ain't. He's gonna beat the hell out of you, boy. He's gonna beat you. That's what he's gonna do. Now Lenny retorted belligerently.
He ain't neither. George would never do that. I've knew George since I forget when, and he ain't never raised a hand or a stick to me. He's nice to me, and he ain't gonna be mean.
Well, he's sick of you, said the rabbit. He's gonna beat the hell out of you, and there ain't, and then you're gonna go away. He's gonna leave you.
No, he won't, Lenny cried frantically. He won't do nothing like that. I know George. Me and him has traveled together.
But the rabbit repeated softly over and over. He's gonna leave you. He's gonna leave you, you crazy bastard. He's gonna leave you. He's gonna leave you, you crazy bastard. Lenny put his hands over his ears.
He ain't. I'm telling you, he ain't. Oh, George.
George came quietly out of the bush, and the rabbit scuttled back into Lenny's head. George said quietly, "What the hell you yelling about?" Lenny got up on his knees.
You ain't gonna leave me, George, are you? I know you ain't.
George came stiffly near and sat down beside him. No.
I knowed it, Lenny cried. You ain't that kind.
George was silent. Lenny said,
George,
"Yeah."
I done another bad thing.
"It don't make no difference," George said. He fell silent again. Only the topmost ridges were in the sun now. The shadow in the valley was blue and soft. From the distance came the sound of men shouting to one another. George turned his head and listened to the shouts. Lenny said,
George,
"Yeah."
ain't you gonna give me hell?
"Give you hell?"
Sure, like you always done before. Like if I didn't have to, you'd say I'd take my $50.
Jesus Christ, Lenny. You can remember nothing that happens, but you remember every word I say.
Well, ain't you gonna say it?
George shook himself woodenly. "If I was alone, I could live so easy." His voice was monotonous. It had no emphasis. I could get a job. I would not have to be in this mess. He stopped.
Go on, said Lenny. And at the end, when the end of the month come, what are we gonna do?
When the end of the month come, I'll get my $50 and go to a cat house. He stopped again. Lenny looked at him eagerly.
Go on, George, go on. You ain't gonna give me no more hell.
"No," said George.
Well, I can go away, said Lenny. I'll go right up them hills and find a cave if you don't want me.
George shook himself again. "No. I want you to stay here with me, Lenny." Lenny said craftily,
Tell me like you done before.
"Tell you what?"
About the other guys and about us.
George said, "Guys like us ain't got no family. They make a little stake and then they blow it in. They ain't got nobody in the world gives a hootin' hell about them."
But not us,
Lenny cried happily.
Tell about us now.
George was quiet for a moment. "But not us," he said.
Because?
"Because I got you."
And I got you. We got each other. And that's who gives a hootin' hell about us,
Lenny cried in triumph. The little evening breeze blew over the clearing, and the leaves rustled in the wind. Waves flowed up the green pool, and the shouts of men sounded again, this time much closer than before. George took off his head. He said shakily, "Take your hat off, Lenny. The air feels fine." Lenny removed his hat dutifully and laid it on the ground in front of him. The shadow in the valley was bluer, and the evening came fast. On the wind, the sound of crashing in the brush came to them. Lenny said,
Tell how it's going to be, George.
George had been listening to the distant sounds. For a moment, he was businesslike. "Look across that river there, Lenny, and I'll tell you, you can almost see it." Lenny turned his head and looked off across the pool at the darkening slopes of the Gabalins. "We're going to get a little place," George began. He reached in the side pocket and brought out Carlson's Luger. He snapped off the safety, and the hand of the gun lay on the back, on the ground behind Lenny's back. He looked at the back of Lenny's head, at the place where the spine and the skull were joined. A man's voice called up the river, and another man answered.
Go on, said Lenny.
George raised the gun and his hand shook, and he dropped his hand to the ground again.
Go on. How's it going to be? How's our little place going to be, George?
"We'll have a cow," said George finally. "We'll have maybe a pig and some chickens. Down on the flat, we'll have a little piece of alfalfa, Lenny."
For the rabbits, Lenny shouted.
For the rabbits. And I get to tend to the rabbits. And you get to tend to the rabbits. Lenny giggled with happiness. And we're going to live off the fat of the land. Yeah, said George. Lenny turned his head. No, no, no. Lenny looked down there across the river, like you can almost see the place. Lenny obeyed him. George looked down at the gun. There were crashing footsteps in the brush now. George turned and looked toward them. Go on, George. When are we going to do it? We're going to do it soon. Me and you? You and me. Everybody's going to be nice to you. Ain't going to be no more trouble. Nobody going to get hurt. Nobody going to steal from him. Lenny said, I thought you was mad at me, George. No, said George. No, Lenny, I ain't mad. I ain't never been mad, and I ain't mad now. There's a thing I want you to know. The voices came close now. George raised the gun and listened to the voices. Lenny begged, let's do it now. Let's go to that place right now. Sure, right now. I gotta. We gotta. And George raised the gun and steadied it, and he brought the muzzle close to the back of Lenny's head. The hand shook violently, but his face set and his hand steadied. He pulled the trigger. The crash of the shot rolled up the hills and rolled down again. Lenny jarred and then settled slowly forward to the sand, and he lay without quivering. George shivered and looked at the gun and then threw it back up the bank near the pile of old ashes where they had had their campfire. The brush seemed filled with the cries of sounds of running feet, and Slim voice shouted, George! George, where you at? But George sat stiffly on the bank and looked at his right hand that had thrown the gun away. The group burst in the clearing, and Curly was ahead. He saw Lenny lying on the ground. Got him, by God. He went over and looked down at Lenny, and then he looked back at George. Right in the back of the head. Huh, he said softly. Slim came directly to George and sat down beside him, sat very close to him. Never you mind, said Slim. A guy got to sometimes. But Carlson was standing over George. How'd you do it? He asked. I just done it, George said tiredly. Did he have my gun? Yeah, he had your gun. And then you got it from him, and you took it from him, and you killed him. Yeah, that's how. George's voice was almost a whisper. He looked steadily at his right hand that had held the gun. Slim twitched George's elbow. Come on, George. Me and you will go and have a drink. George let himself be helped to his feet. Yeah, a drink. Slim said, you had to, George. I swear you had to. Come on with me. He led George to the entrance of the trail, and they headed up toward the highway. Curly and Carlson looked after them, and Carlson said, now what the hell do you suppose is eating them two guys? Powerful ending, eh? We're going to discuss it Thursday, because Friday is technically the last day of school, and we're going to have a send-off. So Thursday at 1 o'clock we'll do it. I think Madam Brown's already sent you an email about that. I'll post the questions tomorrow. We'll do some math Wednesday. Thursday we'll discuss we'll discuss this final chapter in the book as a whole. And on Friday we're going to have a little send-off. Okay, take care, Gunnar Aquay.